with us at PCC headquarters. It's been quite a while, but it hasn't been that long. So when Tim left here, he gained extensive experience in a lot of things, specifically, the special beef industry, the packing industry, and those sort of things. When I found out how blessed we were to have so many Tenet animals, Tim was the third one I reached out to. He's still mad about that.
Third.
So with no further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Tim. He's going to explain what we're doing with the new company called Certified Tenet Beef.
Thanks, Kit. Show of hands, who heard Frank's presentation in the spring when he was here? So most everybody, good. If you haven't, I would recommend getting with Ryan Ash and getting that presentation. Because tonight we're going to go through, just briefly what Tenet is, because I think everybody here, if they're here, knows what Tenet is, what certified Tenet beef is and what it is not, what we're trying to accomplish with that company, some of the strategies that we've been employing to this point, and then really open it up for just questions and discussions. We did this same presentation a week ago in Nebraska, and I think the best and most valuable portion of the entire evening was the questions and discussions. Tenet, very simply, is just genetic markers that identify animals with a predisposition to produce superior tender beef. We all know that by now. Frank, during his time on faculty at Washington State, did a lot of work with the Callipyge gene, identifying in sheep, identifying heavy muscling in sheep, but also in 50 to 60% of the cases resulted in extreme toughness. And once he moved on from that project, he continued on with his work in tenderness in beef. And, to quote Frank, and you heard it in the spring, he calls it a, quote, God thing that he discovered it. Had discovered it and went through a pretty lengthy battle with Washington State to keep his intellectual property. And we're lucky enough to be able to work with him on it today. As Kit mentioned, this started, I think Kit was at last mid-24, third quarter of 2024. Frank, as he mentioned, he was testing a lot of bulls and coming back without any results. He would find a few here or there, but just couldn't find any Tenet bulls. And he reached out to Kit, and Kit, we all know Kit, he was a little reluctant to allow Frank to do this testing. But when he agreed to it, I think both were surprised when they came back, and 2/3, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kit, but 2/3 of the bulls in the sire directory were certified Tenet. And so, we started this discussion, and we'll get to it later in some of these slides, but tenderness really is the most important attribute in both trained and untrained sensory panel tests that we see. It outweighs juiciness and flavor and all these other attributes in trained and untrained sensory panels. So that's what Tenet beef is. Really how it's different is that right now the testing that's out there that we all know about is the identity tests that are looking at the enzymes, calpain and calpostatin, just solely post-mortem enzymatic activity. A lot of tests are looking at leptin genes. Of course, they don't have a ton to do with tenderness and more to do with fat deposition, but we've all got this paradigm that the more marbled product is, the more tender it's going to be. So they're looking at that, and then of course the myostatin gene, which I always point out Piedmontese. That's a particular marker in Piedmontese that makes that particular breed very tender. The other thing is Igenity reports tenderness on a tendency on a scale from 1 to 10, where Tenet is different. You either are Tenet or you are not. The animal is Tenet or it is not. It's a yes or no, it's an on or an off. I put certified tender on here, USDA certified tender. Has anybody seen that claim at all? I know Omaha Steaks right now is the company that's out there and they're pushing it quite a bit. USDA certified tender, I believe, launched in 2011, 2012. I think Cargill played a pretty major role in it. That's identified post-mortem at the plant level using the Warner Breaths or shear force. And I think what has been difficult to see that program go and grow is because of the fact that it is identified post-mortem, and now you're railing and you've got multiple days to work through these tests. So hasn't really been something that's taken off. But the beautiful part, in my opinion, about Tenet is that those animals can be identified live before they hit the plant. And so we can get entire load lots that are identified for tenderness prior to showing up at the plant. So why we think Tenet's important is what I alluded to earlier, and that is that tenderness really is king in both these trained and untrained sensory panels. And so it's probably difficult where you're at to read that, these 3 points, so I'll read them. But 88% of consumers say tenderness is the top driver in satisfaction. Flavor and juiciness, as I mentioned earlier, rank second and third, but neither of them are going to outweigh and outperform in these panel testing tenderness. And then the last one was pretty interesting to me, and of course it's in surveys, and so take it with a grain of salt. The consumers are 2.5 times more likely to remember a negative eating experience due to toughness than to due to flavor or other factors. So I think it's something that's pretty important. We're obviously paying attention to it, but it's interesting that we get these kind of results, but we've always seemed to be focused on other attributes in beef and in carcasses, whether it's marbling, cutability, with ribeye shape or size and things like that, as opposed to tenderness. So this is the only chart that I've got in this presentation. I promise I've got to apologize to Kid. He hates when it goes this route. But I'll describe what we're looking at here. So on the y-axis is the Warner-Bratzler shear force in pounds. I know it's tough to see. And then the box plots that you see are, if you were to look at it on a scale from, say, 1 to 10, with 1 being the toughest and 10 being the most tender, the majority of the animals being produced today are going to fall in that 3 to 4 range. And that's represented by this blue box. So you can see, go ahead.
It's represented by who?
By this blue box, excuse me. The blue box you see on the screen would be representative of the majority of the product that's being sold. The green box is Tenet. And so it's difficult to see, but a significant reduction overall, without digging into the specifics of the numbers, in Warner-Bratzler between conventional product currently being produced and Tenet. Now the orange box is mid-10, and without confusing everyone, Frank has looked into the mid-10 as well. It's a quantitative trait, and so it's additive in nature. And as the markers, because there's more than one, continue to align, the product becomes more and more tender. That said, Frank has looked at Tenet as one achieving the highest ability in an animal to achieve the maximum tenderness scope and a reduction in variability. Now, a few things I want to point out there is that the most variability is in quote-unquote conventional product, and the least variability is on the Tenet product. But I want to point out that there's still variability in Tenet product. So it's probably worth at this point, even with this data, saying this is not a silver bullet, it's not a unicorn, it's not something that once you've got Tenet that there's no other aspects you need to pay attention to in finishing and animal handling. All these things we know play a role in meat quality. It certainly shows a reduction in shear force, but there is still variability. And what I like to point out, and everybody that's read Kit's newsletter probably saw this, but when Kit and I traveled out to Colorado Springs and tried 5 of the PCC genetics and finished beeves that were all Tenet positive, we tried 5 strips and 5 sirloins, and there were variability. At least in my opinion, there's some disagreement on that, but there was variability in the strips and in the sirloins. And what was interesting there, we talked about it earlier tonight, was that the most tender strip didn't necessarily have the most tender sirloin. So there's variability on an intercut basis, on an intracarcass basis. So the reason I bring all of that up is that, you know, I've tried quite a few carcasses at this point, and people will also try a number of different carcasses, and they'll experience some variability, and I think that's normal. Overall, I do think that they're more tender than what we typically see at the store, but I don't want to give anybody the false impression that just because the animal's Tenet, that it's the silver bullet against any and all other aspects. And just real quick, I had a guy call me the other day. He had 900-pound steers that came back Tenet, and he said, "What do you think? I should process them?" I said, "No, don't do that. You know, you still need to finish them." So, and we can come back to that chart too later if there's any questions. So, you know, I think we think Tenet can be a key differentiator and can provide some strategic advantages, really from a first mover advantage. And, you know, I alluded to the USDA certified tender and USDA certified very tender. But outside of that, there's really no program centered around tenderness that's identified on the live side with genomics. You know, there are other things that can be done, whether it's, you know, electrostimulation of carcasses, or, you know, tumblers, or jacquarding or needling product. I mean, there's a lot of mechanical things that can be done. You know, there could be some aging. You know, there's a number of things that can be done. However, identifying animals at the genomic level live that have got the ability to be as tender as we showed there in that previous slide, I think creates a clear and compelling product differentiation. So before we get into what certified Tenet beef really is as a company, what we're trying to do, and some of the strategies, I took a few of these testimonials that Kit had published that I thought were pretty interesting. We heard a couple others tonight that I think Kit will probably get and share in some of his newsletters, but you know, Glenn from Texas said that he had a 2-year-old grass-fed Tenet steer slaughtered and processed. He picked up the meat 7 days ago, and hence no aging. And that last week he gave 4 ribeye steaks to a group of people. He purchased another 4. All the steaks were cooked using the thermometer, and they were sliced and served. And in Glenn's opinion, without exception, the tenderness was superior on those Tenet steaks. John also had a pretty good experience. He said, "We've been raising grass-fed beef since 1989. He said, "We just finished our first Tenet steer and ate our first Tenet ribeye steaks." He said, 2 bites in, my wife looked over and said, "We've never had better. We're staying on this track." And then Keith says, "I purchased 2 of your certified Tenet beef bundles. The top round roast had excellent flavor and was as tender as most fillets." Now, I'd like to talk to him about that, but that's his word. So certified Tenet beef, and really what certified Tenet beef is, it's a label recognizing beef that's been genetically identified to produce beef that is superior tenderness. I use the CAB example a lot because certified Tenet beef isn't going to own cattle. We're not a feed yard, not a packer or retailer or distributor or anything like that. The goal of certified Tenet beef is really to connect producers with Tenet cattle and an end market. We're going to get to some recent developments that we've got, and I think some developing opportunities that are in the early stages. And if we can continue to move these forward, I think it will provide an outlet for them. But that's really what certified Tenet beef is after. And some of the strategies which we'll get to is working through cuttings, taking product that we've identified as Tenet, going to these retailers, going to distributors, and having them cut Tenet product against non-Tenet product, and getting their feedback. Because ultimately, the key to this program moving forward, and we know it, is going to be product quality differentiation. So as I said, the strategy of certified Tenet beef is really about doing these cuttings and these tastings. We've done a number of them with distributors on both the East and West Coast. We've done a number with a lot of small what I would call specialty retailers. And we've had a lot of really positive feedback. We continue to get people reaching out to Certified Tenet Beef several times a week, really, and saying, hey, where can we find it? Where can we buy it? And of course, we're working on that. But there does seem to be a demand. Kit produced, I believe, 40, maybe just under 40 bundles or eights with my Callipyge and sold them, what, Kit? I mean, pretty quick. Yeah. So there's been a lot of demand for it. The feedback that I've heard and that we're getting back on it has been really positive. Another strategy right now, because we don't have a packer, what I would call a packer launch partner, is really working with small direct-to-consumer businesses and trying to work with them and put together some strategic marketing campaigns where we can direct some of the people that we're getting to their product. And so we've got a number of licensing agreements with direct-to-consumer businesses that are looking to begin marketing Tenet beef. And I think that'll be a good grassroots strategy, at least initially, to get the word out there, because it's really not well known at this point. I think we're getting more and more calls. I think it's maybe becoming more known than we think, because we've had the breed associations reach out, and a couple others that are paying attention to it. And so I think it's probably more widely being looked at than even we know. So I alluded to this earlier, is that there's some potential strategic alignment right now that we're exploring with American Farmers Network. And you mentioned, or Kit mentioned, that I'd moved to Idaho recently. Before moving to Idaho, I was with Open Range Beef in Gordon, Nebraska. That was purchased by American Farmers Network. So now American Farmers Network owns the plant in Idaho Falls, Idaho, as well as the plant in Gordon, Nebraska. We've got the capacity to kill about anywhere from 500 to 700 a day, do about 3,500 a week. So the goal for the newly merged companies is to process about 150 to 200,000 head a year. In visiting with ownership and leadership there, they've been very interested and excited about this potential. And the reason is that predominantly grass-fed and grass-fed organic is the products being produced. Now, we do have grain product and we feed grain gap cattle that we're selling to Whole Foods. But I do think that there's a problem, at least we've experienced some problems with really well-finished, well-marbled grass-fed beef that, as I've said to Kit, looks like $100 or $1 million on the plate, and it eats like, a 10-cent coin. I mean, it's just really tough. It looks beautiful, but it is tough in some cases. So they've expressed a lot of interest. I think we're excited about that because, obviously the growth capacity there with the market share that they currently have in both retail. Right now, we're expanding into food service and also international sales. So we are internally testing animals at the plant level to, one, get an idea for where the current universe of cattle ranks in terms of percentage Tenet. We don't know what that is right now. Is it 2% or 10%? So we're going to test several thousand head and see what that looks like. We're also going to identify them and do some internal panel testing with our sales people. We have a robust sales team, both in retail and in food service, and as I said, expanding into international. If it's differentiated in their mind and they're likely to get behind it, I think that it will only push the project further. Now, there's a few things that have got to align for this to work from the business side behind the scenes, but we're doing a lot of testing right now, and I think there's a lot of promise. And we've also talked to Frank about ways we can, increase the turnaround time on some of the testing. I know I've talked to a few of you tonight, and I did in Nebraska as well, about the length of time some of these tests are taking. So we're exploring some of those avenues as well as costs at the lab, et cetera, to make it a little more cost effective for the commercial cattlemen. So I think a really neat development here. There are others. I think, I don't want to speak for Mike. Mike's in the crowd. Appreciate you showing up. We did a great testing with him, and of course we're going to be bothering him to help us with the Tenet launch and to differentiate some product there with him. So put him on the spot, tell him we need it, and go bother Mike. So really next steps, and then I want to open it up to discussions, and that's really where we did, some of our best work in Nebraska. But for a producer, the Tenet beef right now, being able to go visit with Frank on that site, tenetbeef.com, that's where testing information, testing supplies, and all of that can be found. Certified Tenet beef is new and still going through edits, but it was just launched about a week ago. That is really more geared towards direct-to-consumer producers, packers, retailers, distributors, and things like that on the beef side. My contact information's on there as well, and happy to visit with anyone about it. So with that, let's open it up for questions and discussion.
You have a packing plant, a local packing plant that might like this. Do we need you to talk to them about using the Tenet?
So the question, if I understood, is on the local packers, do you need me to talk to them about Tenet?
See, we're from Hartford, we have cabins right up the road.
Yeah. They do a lot of that, other stuff.
Yeah, well, we haven't reached out to them. So, we have not reached out to them. But as far as, I think anyone reaching out to any retailer or packer and asking about it, inquiring of breed associations, I think is a good thing. It definitely gets the awareness out there and just builds awareness. What we're doing as far as the packer, where you're at, is that we are visiting with them as well as other retailers and distributors and doing these cuttings right now to get them interested, show them product differentiation, and show them that there can be a point of differentiation for them in their branded beef programs in the marketplace. Right, and so I'll use AFN as an example. We work with a number of large retailers, and we think that this is a point of differentiation that differentiates us against our competitors to help gain market share and grow volume at these retailers. Now, some of that's grain-fed, some of it's grass-fed, but any packer, whether it's Cavaness or American Farmers Network, we've talked to Creekstone, we've talked to a number of them, and have done some cuttings that are interested in it. We certainly want to, and it's open to all packers, and we certainly want to visit with them about it. Yeah. Jared, did you?
Yeah. Well, you kind of addressed it, but is the focus kind of on the grass-finished beef just because there's maybe a perceived more difficulty in getting consistent tenderness with that, or is this applicable to anything?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, and I'm just going to repeat it but the question was, are we focusing on grass-fed beef right now because that's where the lack of tenderness, may be? I think to a degree, I think for me, it was really more about barrier of entry on the grass-fed side. I think we would have a really hard time going to one of the major packers or even some of the major, the regionals and saying, hey, let's do this for a number of reasons. When I sit in these meetings and they ask, well, how many head are out there? If we were to say, yes, we want to move forward with this, how many are available? Well, we don't know. Right? Because right now, what's being tested with Frank has really been on the seed stock side and on the breeding stock side. We don't know the volume of feeder cattle that are out there. And so, in particular, when we've gone in and said, hey, let's, for a specialty program, maybe it's a load a week. That's not going to get any of those guys remotely interested. And so for me, the reason I thought grass-fed is that it would be an attribute and an add-on attribute that would be a point of differentiation that would not require the volume that some of these, the hurdle rate that some of these, larger packers. And so that's why we focused on the grass-fed. I'll say though that of the Tenet steaks that I've had, the most tender was from a grass-fed animal. Now, I think the grain-fed, my personal opinion is that the grain has been overall better, overall, but the best one I've had has been grass-fed. But really, it was just about barrier of entry. Just I thought that would be the easiest place to get it launched. Could be wrong though.
Have you seen any of these in the packing plant that have gone to prime and high choice become tender as well? How does it correlate?
So the question was, do we see the packers that are going to prime and high choice be tender as well? I think that we know, and it depends on, again, what research you look at, or if you're even into looking at that, but that the correlation between marbling and tenderness is less than 10%. Is less than 10%. And so, you know, I think that there are other attributes there, like, you know, I alluded to it, but, you know, juiciness and things like that, that in these sensory panels drive that. But I'll say that I think there's more, it is subjective, and I think that there's more that goes into that, because even with Warner Bratzler, I mean, we know that the correlation on Warner Bratzler is at 1-to-1, right? So I could, you know, I could have a different sense to the tenderness than maybe Kid or someone else. It's more like 65, 70% correlated on Warner Bratzler. Slice shear force is another one. It's a little bit more correlated than Warner Bratzler, but you know, that's what we have to go on mechanically for a objective, quantifiable number, as opposed to a subjective sensory test.
Earlier, you mentioned Tenet is additive.
Yeah.
More and more markers. Sure. Do you understand what creates that or adds that?
Well, Frank does. Yeah. So he obviously, well, let's use calpain and calprostat in some of the enzymes. And if you were to layer on, because there's 4 markers, if you look at all the research, there's 4 markers that everybody is looking at. And so it can be additive. And so, you know, without getting into to a science lecture, but you know, if the DNA pairs were to be like AA, adenine, were, you know, tender, and TT was tough, you could have AT and TA, right? And it would be additive across those markers. With Frank, the Tenet is completely aligned across all of his markers. And so he does have the ability to show further progressed tenderness, you know, along that distribution, but Tenet is, you know, the superior, it's the quote unquote 10 out of 10, and that's what he's gone with.
So Tim, could you say that the single individual that you thought was the best, the grass-fed, could it be even more than a 10? Could that steer have been tested even higher than what he claims is the top end of it?
Yeah, so the comment was the grass-fed Tenet beef that I had, could it be greater than a 10? Could it have been, you know, more than what Frank had tested? I think absolutely. I think it would be foolish for us to think, and I don't want to speak for Frank, but my opinion is that this is an addition to the markers that have been discovered. I think it, based on the data, it takes it a step further. But for us to say that we've now identified all of the markers that are going to identify maximum tenderness, I don't believe that. You know, and I think there are other things that play a role in terms of, you know, animal handling and how the animal was, you know, treated. Was it worked up before, you know, being processed and slaughtered? I mean, there's a number of other factors that go into it. But yeah, it could definitely be beyond, you know, where Frank is at. And I think that, you know, when you go back to that chart, I think that's why you see that kind of, that variability. particularly if they come from, from tenant animals, particularly when they come from contemporary groups that, had the same ration, were treated the same way, slaughtered and processed the same day, the same amount of aging, same cold chain management, and all those things. When you have that variability, there's obviously something further there. Now, that's got the least variability, but why I keep harping on that is that all the studies show that we can sense in sensory panels a half a kilogram or about a pound difference in Warner Bratzer. And so if there's a 4 pound, and there was, it's hard to see, but if there's a 4 pound difference on those Tenet animals, on those Tenet beef, realistically, you would be able to, in a panel testing, be able to tell the difference across those. So that's why, I bring up the variability, because I don't think it's something that once it's tested Tenet, every time you sit down and it's going to be a 4 kilogram, Warner Bratzer, and it's even in uniform, and there's no variation, because there clearly is.
This is all very interesting and exciting to me, but I'm wondering, if you're like an 80 cow commercial cow person, I don't know that it's going to do us very much good for a long time, but I'm wondering if it would help if we're selling red heifers, if they were certified kid.
Yeah, so the question was, as a 80 head cow-calf producer, certified Tenet calves may not provide a ton of value for a long time. However, identifying Tenet heifers and selling, bred Tenet animals, is there value there? I sure think so. I think there's been a lot of demand for it. I think Frank, if he were here, he'd attest to it as well. He's getting calls. I think Kit and some of the CPs are as well. I don't know where you're located, but I do, I want to bring up your point about, small cow-calf producers, because I think it's an important one, particularly on testing for these Tenet animals. That's been one of the concerns that we've had about promoting it right now, because again, without a market for these calves, the last thing we want is for a cow-calf producer to go out and test their calves and, have 80 and then end up with 25 or 30% Tenet, or not have a full load lot. Not, where do you go with those cattle? Where you're at regionally, when this gets, and I say when, but when this gets launched, when there's a partner that has got demand for these cattle, likely it will be regionally at first. And so, where you're at regionally, I think is important. The other thing we're doing is we are launching on tenetbeef.com, Frank's site, for lack of a better term, a classifieds page, so that people that are either looking for them, small direct-to-consumer, another small regional packer, or branded beef program that's looking for Tenet animals that wants to use that as a point of differentiation, can connect with people in their area. I think that'll be, that'll end up playing a pretty key role. But then also, we, with some of our, when I say we, American Farmers Network or others that are looking and can direct our procurement people to those specific regional areas. So I do think it's going to grow slow. I think it's a good point. I definitely wouldn't rush out and be testing, a bunch of calves. But I do think there's demand for the breeding stock. And I think Kit would attest to that, and particularly on the bull sale side as well.
Are these genes dominant or recessive? And how hereditary are these genes for Tenet? Are they dominant, recessive?
Yeah, so
Any overlap?
Yep, good question. So the question is, are the genes dominant or recessive? How heritable are they? So, like I said, it's a quantitative trait, so it's not like a coloring, where you could carry a red gene and be black. It's additive in nature. So when you're Tenet, you are completely aligned at all of the markers that Frank has identified. And as far as heritability, what I'll say is that because it is quantitative, in the example that I gave earlier, you can have 2 non-Tenet animals produce a Tenet calf. And if they're both Tenet, you're going to produce a tenant animal. But very heritable. Frank, I think ran, and he's got some papers published you can find online, and maybe we'll send them out, or get them to Kit and make them available, where he talks about the heritability with his breeding program over I think it was a 3 or 4 year period. It was extremely heritable. But we'll get that paper if you want to dig into it. That'll get the heritability numbers for you. Yeah.
How long before you predicted, like in a sale ring, if a fellow brings in below the calves and they're tenant, out of tenant bull and stuff, before the feedlot buyer will give a premium on the hoof?
The question is, when do I predict a producer will be able to bring in tenant calves and receive a premium from buyers in the sale ring? I think it'll be a while. Yeah, I think it'll be a while. I think one, you've got to develop a market for it, and it's got to spread. One thing I want to point out, that if I was competing with certified tenant beef, and I was a USDA, I was the Big Four, and I was a USDA guy, USDA certified tender, Omaha steaks, and all that, what I would do is I would try to go find tenant calves. I know about them now live. I don't have to deal with the post-mortem testing, and I would buy those calves. That's what I would do. So maybe not as long as I think, if they're smart, but maybe it's not a major point of differentiation. And, maybe they don't want to go through that procurement process, and who knows? But that's what I would do. So I think there's an opportunity for tenant, whether it's certified tenant beef or it's USDA certified tender.
What's the testing turnaround time?
It's too long right now. So the question is, what's the testing turnaround time? It should be 2 weeks right now. But I've heard that it's longer than that it's taking longer than that. Now, in Frank's defense, he is working through some lab changes and bringing some things stateside that's going to bring down cost and speed that process up. But right now, it's taking a little bit longer than anybody would like, and it's about
5 weeks.
5 weeks for the gentleman. So yeah, too long. We talked to Frank, and this is just a side note, about, hey, how can we develop the technology, or what can we bring here closer to home that is going to turn these tests around? And what technologies are out there to speed up testing? Ideally, what I'd love to find, and I don't know that we can find it, I've talked to Frank about, is, are there ways and systems we can set up at the plant level where we can test them post-mortem and get a turnaround in 24 to 48 hours while they hang and then rail them off at that point? If we could do that, that would be a game changer. I don't know enough about the testing technology and the equipment that he's using and things like that. But there's been enough, once you learn it, like NIR technology, that can advance to where you can identify some of those things and get near immediate turnaround. But that'll definitely take some time. So I want to introduce Mike Calicrate. He was the third leg of the stool of the test that we had out in Colorado Springs, and can offer a lot to this discussion. Appreciate you being here.
Hey, thank you, Tim, and thanks, Kit, for the opportunity to be involved in this. I was pretty excited when I ate the meat. We cooked, like Tim already described, what the test consisted of, and we compared it to my stuff. So I had a Wagyu Angus that was just a normal kind of high choice, low prime, and then there was also a Wagyu in there. I mean, a real well-marbled Wagyu in there, and the Tenet was markedly better. It was in tenderness. And I just think about what we've done in our industry in the last, say, 50 years that we've been involved in really reducing meat quality. I mean, as an industry, why in the world are we using performance-enhancing drugs that reduce tenderness and flavor and digestibility? I think the digestibility thing is really interesting to me. I mean, how many times you go out to an Outback Steakhouse or any of the chains,
And every one of those strips, ribeyes, maybe not the tenderloin, has been blade tenderized. So rather than just not using performance enhancing drugs, we're going to do all these things to make it edible. But how do you feel after that meal? Yeah, you may have been able to chew it, but how well did it digest? And I think about, folks that I know, that are older than me that talked about how ground beef used to be so much better, and they just don't feel great after eating ground beef at the rest home these days, or in the hospital these days, or at the school lunch program these days. And I just think it's pretty exciting when an industry can come around and find a genomic solution to tenderness and just don't mess it up. If we can identify these animals and let people know what they are, and I think it's exciting to me to see this. And right now, man, I hope that cattle prices stay high. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow when Trump's latest statement hits these markets. He's basically saying we need a meat packer investigation, and boy, I can't agree more. I just hope that the markets respond in a positive manner. But I think about what Tim was saying. Where is the demand for these animals? Let's say we go ahead and we buy the Tenet genetics and we're going to produce these calves. We really do hope to get a premium. But honestly, think back over the last 50 years. How many times have premiums actually materialized and stayed? I mean, to a meat packer, premium is a 4-letter word. They don't like to pay it. So what's the opportunity in selling direct? What about that? And I know there's a lot of people that have done it, and now they're saying, well, these cattle prices are high enough, I don't think I want to do it. So somebody pull out your phone and get the calculator. I want to work through a calculation with you. Can somebody do that?
Jared's on it.
You got it? Are you ready? Can we make a 1,200 pound animal out of our cattle? I know they're 1,400 pounds right now on average going through a USDA plant, but why do we want to make them that big? Let's make them 1,200, okay? And I'm gonna feed it, and I'm gonna kill it at Callipyge Cattle Company. We have our on-site slaughter. So there goes the other thing that you talked about that can potentially reduce meat quality, and that's stress in transit. What if we could kill these animals a lot closer through a small plant? That we don't have to, there's a lot of cattle out of Iowa now traveling to Pennsylvania for slaughter at 500 to 600 miles. Think about a 1,500 pound, 1,400 pound animal traveling that far, what impact it may have. So let's take a 1,200 pound animal and multiply that times 0.42. What do you get? 504 pounds. So that's going to be the retail yield. If you just take the live animal and a finished animal, it's going to yield 63% to the carcass. They're going to yield 42% to the retail, and that's boneless. If it's bone-in, you can increase that 5%. So the bone-in is worth about 5% more yield. But let's go 42% and say it's all going to be boneless. Today, the big box scanner price, average price of beef is $9.85 a pound. That's Walmart, that's Kroger, that's all at Safeway, that's all your big stores. The USDA does a monthly scanner price analysis, and the last report was $9.85. So multiply that times your 508, did you say, or 504?
504 is $49.64.
Okay, now subtract $1,100 in processing and making that fully retail ready.
$38.64.
Now divide it by 1,200.
$3.22.
That's the price, that's your net price for your finished animal. What is the fat cattle market today? $220. You're getting a, I mean, my goodness. And now what's the difference between that? That's $1. That's $1,200 a head. That's $1,200 a head, right? Yes, it is. It's $1,200 a head. Why are we allowing the big packers and the big retailers to make that money? And if we have something as special as Tenet, let's do more direct to consumer marketing with that. Let's think about how we can come together as a group, perhaps, and market that and really put the money back to the farm and ranch gate. I mean, that's why I get out of bed every day, is how do we increase income at the farm and ranch gate? And if you look at what's been lost over the last, since 1970, in 1970, the producer of livestock was getting 82% of the retail dollar. Today, it's about 54%. It went as low as 27% during COVID. But why are we just sitting here asking for a little premium? Let's get the real money, $1,200 a head. And we can do that right now. We can do it. But we have to convince the consumer that we have something that's worth buying. And I think the whole story is worth telling. So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike.
I didn't officially introduce Mike. This is Mike Callipyge. He has a ranch, feedlot, a packing plant just across the Kansas border, St. Francis. He has a processing plant and 2 retail stores in Colorado Springs, and that's where Tim and I went. Mike processed those 5 animals, and we went down there to test them. And we did test them against a Wagyu cross and a Wagyu steak, and the Wagyu was the most marbled, but the toughest. Marbling is not tenderness. But when somebody asked about demand for calves, and I reached over to Mike and I said, do you want to create a demand for Tenet calves? And he says, of course I do. So I think it's there. You know, we're going to sit down and talk a little bit more with Mike, but he's got the feedlot, he's got the packing plant, he's got the retail store. He's what we've been looking for to get this thing off the ground. I mean, there's going to be bigger players come in, but if Mike believes in it, Mike can do all that for us. You know, I don't see any reason why we don't start, but don't get carried away yet, because Tim's going to hold you back. Any other questions for Mike before he walks out?
I got a question for Mike. Mike, in a normal market, what do you think the premium ultimately is going to be? If I'm a direct seller, how much can I ask above the regular commercial fat price?
You know, it's not a hard sell. If you're selling your animals at the Walmart price for, I know you didn't ask selling about retail. You didn't ask about selling retail. You asked about selling in the fat cattle, right?
But I didn't say that right. No, it's a direct to consumer. So when I price my home raised beef, my home finished beef to the lady in town, and I tell her I have Tenet, can I ask for 10%? If I use the fat cattle market as a benchmark, you know, where can I go because I'm working, I paid for the genetics, where can I take that price to?
I don't think you can use the fat cattle market as a benchmark. All the money is beyond the fat cattle market, the packer profit and the retail margin. If you don't get that, why would you want to sell your beef at a discount to Walmart?
I don't.
So let's get the Walmart price. It's $9.85 right now, and I think that's what you charge. But you got to understand too, why are retail prices as high as they are? Well, the retailer has pushed it as high as they think they can, to a point where they're probably needing to kind of cool it.
Yeah.
And I'm just saying, if you're pricing at those levels, you're getting back $3.22 a pound on your finished cattle. Now that works. That makes you money. So I'd say, let's sell at that Walmart big box price and not have too much of a conversation about, well, I'm special and, you know, I treat my animals well. I mean, they got that whole story that everybody on the internet tells, and whether it's true or not, isn't necessarily right. But I just, your premium right now, if you can sell direct to consumer, is about $1,200 a head. And I wouldn't want to stop short of, you know, to sell to a feedlot or to a slaughterhouse. So, but what I wanted to mention is we have the capacity at Pharo Cattle Company to we built our own supply chain, basically. If you go back to 1999, I remember the year. It was between Christmas and New Year's, 98 and 99. I found out I couldn't sell my fat cattle anymore. I had 14,000 head in a 12,000 head feedlot. And the National Beef was my only buyer. And I was getting cattle coming in. I couldn't ship any because I couldn't sell them. And National Beef finally told me, he says, I can't buy your cattle anymore. So I called Dan Glickman, and he forced ConAgra in Greeley, that's now JBS, but he forced them to buy all of my cattle. And I laid out about a year. I emptied the feedlot, completely went empty. And I decided, the heck with this, I'm going to sell meat instead of livestock. And that's when Ranch Foods Direct started in the spring of 2000. But half of what we do is for other people. Half of what we do is just trying to connect as many other people to the end consumer as we possibly can and increase their income. We've got to get back our share of this consumer dollar, or we just cannot sustain the ranching industry. And this is why I just hope tomorrow is going to be, and I hope Trump follows through. I hope it's just not a head fake. I hope we can we've already proved the case in court with the IVP Tyson case, the Pickett case back in 96. It went to trial in 2004. The jury awarded us $1.28 billion, and then the judge reversed the jury verdict, and we never even had a chance at injunctive relief. But what that case did was it proved our case that the big packers do manipulate the market, but it also gave, with the judge reversing the case and the Supreme Court refusing to hear it, it also gave the big packers the green light to pillage and plunder all they want. And so we have to build another pathway to the consumer, I think, if we're going to. And we don't have to do it, in a widespread way, but we have to do it in a way significantly enough to where we can prove that we need more money at the farm and ranch gate over what the packers are paying us right now. And I think, Ranch Foods Direct is just one company, but there's not that many, and we need a lot more. So.
This Tenet, since it originated with the sheep up there in Washington, correct?
You say it originates with the sheep?
I say this Tenet, it originated with the sheep up there in Washington.
Tim will answer that.
No, the question was, does Tenet originate with sheep? No. Callipyge is the gene in sheep that Frank did his original work on, and when that was discovered, that had to do with excessive kind of meat yield, but also excessive tenderness.
No, toughness.
Excuse me, toughness. And when he moved on from that project, he stayed involved in tenderness.
Is this Tenet going to break over into other species like pork and stuff?
Probably not.
Yeah, I would say I have not heard that. The question was, is it going to move over into other species? And I don't believe Frank's doing any work on Tenet in any other species. Someone else might be, but Frank's not. Well, I appreciate Mike's perspective, and I think he made a lot of really good points. We get almost, like I said, multiple times a week, people saying, and I just got a guy from Illinois said, hey, he's got relationships with food service, and he's looking for Tenet product, and we don't have anywhere to point him. Getting involved potentially with Mike and Callipyge Beef and Ranch Direct, and having an avenue to point some of these people to, I think would be huge. If you're doing direct to consumer, then we want to point them to your programs as well, because we do get those that are looking for the product. There's demand for it.
Everybody's looking for the beef, and this group here has a lot of Tenet cattle. We just need to get it processed to the beef. And I'm crossing my fingers with Mike that, this may be our starting point where we can, he's got the whole facility direct to, to retail stores. And we'll talk a little bit more, but I'm talking to our producers, our spring calving producers, our fall calving producers. When you preg check your yearling heifers, and you've got 10% open or 15% open, Tenet tests those heifers for that. Heifers are easy to finish, especially at that age. So if we could take them all and put them in Nathan's feedlot or Mike's feedlot, or run them on grass from May through the end of the fall, I think we can create the product if Mike is willing to market it. So then we can say, call Ranch Direct Foods up. They'll ship you some. Mike and I used to ride bulls about 50 years ago together. We both look pretty good for that, don't we?
Yeah.
I'm slow, so I want to make sure I understand something. So if we started checking tenant testing all of our heifers, and started now over a period of years, your entire cow herd would be tenant tested. And if we bought all tenant certified bulls, then based on what you said earlier, there would be no need to tenant test calves. Because if the bull in a closed herd, if all the bulls and all the females are tenant certified, then your entire calf crop would be tenant, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you're doing it direct and you don't, want to market or utilize the certified tenant beef seal, thered be no reason. But as far as tracking purposes, we would absolutely want to make sure that we're processing animals that have got a test against them. So, but yeah. Yep, you're absolutely right.
Tim, is there a fee structure in place yet for that certification through the company, or will there be a fee structure?
Yeah, so certified tenant beef is got a licensing agreement, and we just got it set as a flat $25 a head fee.
So Frank gets 25 to test and you get 25 to market?
If you're using the certified tenant beef seal, we've got it set up as $25 a head. Yeah, and the beef. So, and really why it's still being worked out. I don't know that we're sold on that being the number. What we did is we backed in, we looked at the yields on the middles and some of the thins and where we think, and what product we think we could market and differentiate, and what value creation or additional premiums could be there to provide an ROI. So, that's where it's at right now, and we'll see how it develops. When we've talked to American Farmers Network, of course, they're looking to do a little bit more volume. They've talked about it's structured as a X cents per pound, almost like CAB does now. So that's what we've got structured. Yep.
Not to get off the subject, but I had a question I forgot to ask Kid earlier. On these bulls, how do you do that grass efficiency test? Do you base it on the ultrasound of the ribeye and the rate of gains of calves out there on grass, or how do you do it?
Okay, but could you repeat the question? I was talking to Kit and didn't hear.
How did we create the grass efficiency formula?
That's the question, how we created the grass efficiency index. So
Tim was here when we did that.
Yeah. So basically all it is if you look at the BIF data, it'll show what the projected mature weight is for an animal at a given hip height and time. And so at that time we were processing the bulls, and in order to, within a group, eliminate the variables, we would take the hip heights of those animals at a specific age, and based on their hip height at, say, 12 months of age, it would project out its mature weight at a body condition score of 5. And the BIF publishes these charts, and I can send them out. But so what we did to be able to look at animals at different frames, we would take the hip height and take its weight divided by its projected mature weight, and it would give you a percent. And so within a contemporary group, you can see, based on the relative performance of an animal on grass as opposed to its absolute weight, how it was performing. And so the idea was an animal that was being developed alongside its contemporaries was reaching a higher percentage of its mature weight at the same age was more grass efficient.
As long as it's good grass.
Doesn't matter. Good grass or bad grass. if they're all running together, if I've got 40 bulls running together and I get hip heights and I know the ages on all those bulls, then I can see what percentage of its mature weight it's achieving within that contemporary group.
Okay, but like during the drought, you run out of a good grass and they're running on a bunch of tumbleweeds, that's gonna change it.
You can
But
still
that makes
compare.
it- yeah, and you can still compare within a contemporary group because all of those bulls or cows or anything else are still running on that drought condition.
Tim created this for us. It's based on a formula that Johann Zietsman has been using for decades. I tell people when they ask me about it, it's more of a measurement of early maturity than anything else. You know, animals that have reached that are 50% of their mature weight are better than animals that are only 40% of their mature weight, projected mature weight. That's early maturity. So in finishing, you know, an animal with a high grass efficiency score will finish quicker because they stop growing bone and muscle and start putting on fat. Females need to stop growing bone and muscle and start putting on fat before they can get bred. So I think it's a valuable tool. I didn't understand it until Tim explained it to me after we attended a Johann Zietsman seminar, but I think it's good. Any other questions for Tim? Any other questions for me?
Tim brought up that they're putting together a classified section on the Tenet website, but we also have a classified section that we could be using in the meantime.
And I think some are using it. We have a classified page on our website. Frank is putting together a classified page on his website. I'm not sure if Tim will either, but you know, that's how people get connected is through those sort of things. But don't be too busy to check those things out.
What can we advertise if we don't test?
Well,
Just throwing it out there, I mean, how you know they check it?
how are you going to tell the truth if you don't know what the truth is?
Okay, but it's been said we need to slow down.
Tim says that.
I know he does.
And I think Tim's right.
And I talked to Tim about what I was gonna do before I did it, and he said, oh man, I think go ahead. Of course, he didn't have to help me pay for it.
Yeah.
It's easier to spend other people's money.
You know, like Brett was saying, you know, if you have all Tenet bulls, all Tenet cows, you don't have to test anymore, but you cannot use the Tenet logo, that one right there, like to market your animals until you have a trademark agreement. So you can, you know, if you don't test, I mean, if you do basically what Brett was saying, you know, you've got no chance of it not being.
I'm convinced to test, I'm just saying it for the crowd.
You saying what?
I'm just saying it for the people that are here, I'm convinced to test, and what I did proved my point.
I don't know what you did, but.
I tested 79 heifers, and 52% of them come back 10.
Okay.
Ken over here.
We've been talking in our circles in Indiana and the Midwest about your program and other grass-fed producers in the Midwest who have got good connections to pretty decent retailers or markets. And their question to me is how are you all, and I'm obviously wanting to test and I'm here to promote what you're doing, but they're asking me, how is he gonna prevent us from circumventing the system and calling it something else or what have you? So I don't wanna argue with them, it's, I wanna hear it from.
Well, that's a good question. You know, and there was a time I thought about that. But, Frank knows me too well for me to get away with it. But, yeah, I could call it PCC tender. But I still need to get them tested. I don't think, Tim's talking about, taking slaughtered animal and getting a test right there so we know that that animal started out tended. You know, I think that's going to be brilliant. I don't know how close, how long that'll take.
Yeah, I don't know.
I guess the second part to that question is he allowing people to, anybody to test, or, you know, so if they get the results back, they can go market it how they want.
He's supposed to have somebody that's watching the internet daily for him. And you know more about that?
Yeah, so he's using in AI that basically, and a lot of the large packers do it and feed yards do it too. They've got AI that will monitor internet, and if there's a mention of something, it will alert them to it. And he's doing that. But I think it's a good question because we talked about it, and I think he'll absolutely have some of that. I think that there'll be some copycat. I think there'll be people that'll just use the name and the logo and not go through the proper channels. I think part of the reason for wanting to require it has to do with brand integrity, and being able to, not produce or sell beef under the Tenet label that's not Tenet. And so that's the reason for testing and governing it. But yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of, I hope there is a lot of copycat and Me Too. And if there is, that means it's taken off. But I fully expect that to happen if it takes off. Yep.
How long before you think we'll have a lab closer that we can get quicker returns on the test?
I would think, so the question was how quickly do I think we'll have a lab closer that's going to have, quicker turnarounds? I think we're, a couple months away, maybe sooner. And I don't want to speak for Frank. I'd reach out to him, but he's been working hard at it and they're making a lot of progress. And, you can't patent a DNA sequence, but you can patent a test, right? And so I think PCR and some of these other tests, those are patented. Frank's got a specific testing sequence and technology that is patented. So it does take a lot. There's NDAs that are signed, and it takes a lot for him to get it set up. The technology, evidently, to run the specific markers is also specialized in the equipment. And so, the larger company that he was using internationally also has, some labs here that they're training to get it done. But once that's done, it should bring down the turnaround time and hopefully cost.
Will it ever be available to test with the other genetic testing companies, Neogen, so that you can submit parentage test, DNA, everything at the same time as Tenet, get one sample?
Yep, good question. So the question was, will there ever be a time you can do the test at Neogen or some of these other companies, so you can do parentage and things? Frank's talking about introducing that at his lab. He's reluctant to, give the DNA markers and sequencing and the testing to a competitor. I know he's talked to the Red Angus Association and a number of others about doing, parentage and testing for A2 and some other things like that with his lab.
Could they get to a point where, like they were saying, if you have Tenet bulls and Tenet cows, if it's connected to the registration, you have data, if you have it associated with the registration that shows they're both Tenet, that you could get away with not testing offspring if it's confirmed parentage from two?
That'd be great. We should talk to Frank about that. That will ultimately be his call, but it's a good question.
I don't think so. I think we have to know, what if your neighbor's bull got in there and bred your cow and that calf's not tended?
But if it's parentage, he's saying.
Parentage, okay. Yeah, that's a valid thought.
Yeah, I think so.
Tim, didn't Frank say that there was still only a 90% chance if both parents are Tenet to get Tenet, that there's still a small chance that they cannot be Tenet?
I haven't heard that.
I thought that's what he said last spring.
Did he? See,
I think what he said was that he couldn't guarantee it, but he thought it would be true.
Yeah. So, and that's why on all these presentations, he's got 99% and things. He's saying, from the science aspect, he can't guarantee it. But I don't know that he's found it. I think we should follow up with him. I've always heard him say, if the bull and the dam are Tenet, the calf will be Tenet. And then he won't say it with 100% certainty because he's a scientist, but he hasn't seen it. But we should get with him if that's what he mentioned in his presentation.
Yeah, when I talked to him last, we've tested about 600 head, and so far we've never seen 2 tenants produce a non-tenant. Now that doesn't mean it's not possible it might happen.
Yeah.
When I talked to him, he said he's never seen it, and I've never seen it in our herd. So
Yeah.
it seems unlikely, but maybe still possible.
It'd be interesting just knowing, how he's lining up those trades. But we'll get with him. Oh, I've been.
Any more questions?
I guess I got one question is there any, talking to Frank, do they have any idea why PCC is so much higher than everything else? Like, what is that? How does that?
I have an idea. You've heard it, probably.
Yeah.
We're not the only ones that have fairly high percentages of Tenet. We may be the leaders, but I'll have to go back in history. When I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, you could butcher any old cow, Hereford cow, out of the pasture, and she was good eating. And that's kind of what Mike's talking about. We've lost some things. In the 80s, we started the race to make them as big as we could, as fast as we could. Somewhere in that game, the beef industry said, hey, this isn't as Tenet as it used to be. So we start selecting for marbling. That's not the answer. But, if you look at our Angus or Red Angus, we have never, ever selected for extreme growth. In fact, we're selecting for the opposite. We want high or low maintenance requirements and just enough growth to fit our environment. And I'm pretty sure that's where it is. I became aware of it probably in the 90s, and I said, it's really hard for me to find a steak at a restaurant that I'll eat unless it's a flat iron or a fillet. I'd rather eat, you've heard me say this, I'd rather eat chicken than a tough steak. And chicken doesn't cost $40 or $50 a pound. But that's my theory. Frank uses more scientific words, but it's about the maintenance requirements. Anybody else have a theory?
I got more questions, not theory.
Oh, you got more questions?
Is there in place yet a system or a process to be a buyer, a feedlot, a grass finishing program, a grain finishing feedlot for the Tenet program yet? Are there trusted systems in place that?
We haven't created the supply yet. We need to create a supply and let Mike sell it, and then other people are going to be paying attention and say, yeah, I want those calves.
So right now, the retailer you're working with, obviously, is he the only retailer that small or mid-size, or?
Well, I'm sure there's others, but Tim.
Well, okay. So, it's not, I think we've got more conversations with Mike. It's not that we've launched anything formally yet. And it's the chicken or the egg conversation. The last thing I want to do is go out there and know what we have to be able to definitively say, here's what we can produce, and then have producers from all over calling saying, I've tested and there's no place to sell, my cattle. And now we've got egg on our face. So we're trying to set this up where we create the demand, and whether it's with Mike, whether it's with American Farmers Network, whomever it may be, that says, this is differentiated. We've done the cuttings and we've tested the animals. We've done our own internal panel testing. This is differentiated. This is something that we think can help us in the marketplace. Let's launch it. And then identify individual, and we've talked about it internally, individual retailers that we would go to, and they would be an individual launch partner. Because my guess is we could probably do about a load a week, because there's going to be, with one yard, say, there's going to be regionality to this. So as soon as we say, okay, we're going to move forward, for this example, Mike, I'm sorry, I'm just going to use you. In Kansas, I'm going to get a call from a guy in Alabama that's got 5 head that, wants to find a home, because it happens, find a home for those animals. My recommendation for someone like that would be find people that are in your community and locally that also want to produce or doing direct to consumer or something like that. But in that circumstance, you might have Kansas and Oklahoma and Nebraska and Colorado, whatever that region looks like, and how many producers are testing. And then you've got the weights of those animals that are going to be all over the board. So there's going to be, there's a lot to work through. And the reason I know that is I deal in specialty programs now. One of the hardest programs we deal in is USDA organic. And it's not dairy cross, and there's maybe 14, 15,000 head of beef on beef organic cows in the U.S. And so we try to put together a 5,000 or 6,000 head a year program for certain retailers that are demanding that and want it, and that becomes really difficult because you're putting together maybe not entire load lots, so now you're using collection points, and the ages and weights and quality. There's a number of factors there that go into that production, and I expect early on it would be that way as well. What I get excited about is if we've got someone like Mike and Ranch Direct Foods where we can work regionally and produce it that is not specific for a retailer, and have got an avenue and a place to point people with that demand, then sure, the supply is going to be a little uneven at first and it'll be a little bulky, but it can grow organically and naturally without these big bottlenecks that we would end up having. Because I'm trying to be sensitive to not going out there and launching something and getting Frank flooded with samples and getting calls from all over the U.S. with 20, 30, 40 head of Tenet calves, and we don't have a home for them. So I'm just trying to be careful that way.
I think the direct to consumer people are going to that's what we're going to bounce off of. Are you selling direct to consumers yet? I think you guys, when the word gets out, that's where a lot of it's going to start. If your customers say, man, that was the best, and I'm going to pay extra for it every time, and their neighbors find out, but there's no easy answers to when the sale barn is going to pay you a premium for your Tenet calves. No. It may not happen.
Hey, Kit, I got a question. We do some direct sales to the end market, and thinking of Mike here with a feedlot, is there a silver bullet out there to always get a consistent beef? Like if you feed a lot of corn, a lot of times it ends up being pretty good beef. But we're talking if you feed too much grass, you get that yellow fat. And people sort of shy away from that yellow fat. Sometimes you get a really good tender beef, next it's a little bit tough. Is this Tenet beef going to be a silver bullet that you're always going to get that good tender beef? And how is Mike feeding them cattle? If we want to stay away from grain, Ken Hamilton says you need to feed like 50% fermented hay versus a good quality alfalfa.
There's 1,000 programs out there.
So how's Mike doing it that's consistent every time?
Well, are you consistent every time, Mike? I think it depends on genetics as much as anything, too.
Well, we've got the same rations as we feed every time.
And it's always consistent.
And finish point is also important. That animal needs to be finished.
Yep.
And that's all plane of nutrition stuff. We need to be putting animals on a high enough plane of nutrition to get them finished and get the marbles. And it's important to hit a target weight too. We want to feed to the genetic potential of the animal. So if the genetic potential is 1,200 pounds, we don't want to be selling it at 900 off grass. We want to try to get that extra 300 pounds. The dollars right. Here's the horse is.
Are you saying that all your cattle are grass-fed?
No, he's got a feedlot.
Okay.
But to answer his question, this is not a silver bullet.
No, and Tim said that more than once tonight. I don't know what a unicorn is, but he says this is not a silver bullet. Meaning, but I think what Tim and I are talking about is once this takes off, I think it's going to eliminate those terrible eating experiences. But I guarantee you can have all Tenet animals and you can screw something up and they're still going to mess it up. So we still got to think about how we handle the animals, the nutrition, like Mike says. You know, if we're out on his desert way, they're not going to get very fat.
My brother had a guy from Australia live with him for a while.
What?
My brother had a guy from Australia rooming with him for a while. And you could have the best, most tenderest, best steak possible. And he'd ground it bigger and hit it with a blowtorch for about 20 minutes and then flip it over and do it again. So you know it was not any good after that. But that was the way he learned to cook it.
Yeah.
That's the way they ate it. And so the next time we hit his blowtorch and said, we're going to cook the steaks you're going to eat what we cook. And
Up on top.
and he was a changed man after that.
Marbling doesn't have anything to do with tender.
Not over 10%. Oh, the tenderness, yeah, but the G, no.
The ones that are more marbled, I'm just curious, you said you ate several steaks, did y'all have the marbling stats on the ones that you ate?
So the question was, I mentioned earlier that the more marbled steaks are what I preferred. I wouldn't say that they were necessarily any more tender. I think that there were other attributes there that I was picking up on. I tend to like grain finished a little more. But I've had grass fed that was low choice, high select. That's been extremely tender. And we had, and it wasn't necessarily Tenet, but going to your question on marbling, the Wagyu steak that we tried, the three of us in Colorado Springs, Mike, Kit, and myself, was the most marbled, but the least tender. But within Tenet, I tend to like them grain finished and a little more marbled. But that's why I put this slide back up here, because we got a lot of questions about this in Nebraska, is that there's still a lot of variability, or what I think is a lot of variability in Tenet. It's the least variable of all that are tested across those markers. But, it isn't a silver bullet, and it's not going to be just one consistent Warner Bratzler, for lack of a better description, every time it's Tenet, and there is variability. And then I always go back to the correlation between how we perceive Warner Bratzler data. It isn't, it is not 1-to-1. So, but I think personally finish is still wildly important. I know what all the studies say in terms of correlation between marbling and tenderness, but I think finish is still really important.
How important do you think the markers on the bull test for marbling and the bulls, I think on that markers?
So is your question the marbling DNA in the bulls, and if there's a correlation between that and Tenet?
No, is that going to make a difference in finish amount of grain? The ones that
For tenderness? Oh, well, yes. If you're selecting for a marbling DNA in bulls, which is the leptin genes, if you're selecting for leptin genes in bulls and you finish them out, they're going to marble more. And that's what we've done as an industry. That's why.
But that doesn't mean they're tender.
But that doesn't mean they're tender, right? But he was asking, is the marbling DNA, is that going to lead to more well-marbled beef? Absolutely. And that heritability is extremely high, like over 80%.
But as Tim said earlier, and Frank said a year ago, the biggest complaint consumers have about beef is the inconsistency in tenderness. I mean, that's been my concern since maybe the late 1990s. I mean, I just got tired of buying a steak that was well marbled and I couldn't get through it. Take it home for my dog. So if we do have a tool that can take care of the low end of the tenderness and move everything up higher, I think that's going to make a difference eventually. But we're at the ground level. It's going to be slow.
I got a question, and I want to ask Mike. Do you feed low quality cattle or high quality cattle to achieve your goal? I think that's the question. Whether they're tenant or not.
So when I decided I was going to sell meat instead of livestock, here I am growing up in an industry that I saw go in the wrong direction. I decided, okay, I'm going to be responsible for the meat on the plate. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to find the best Angus cow I can find, and I'm going to breed it to a Wagyu bull because I want to get the marbling. I want the quality. And then I'm not going to use performance-enhancing drugs. So I'm going to finish those cattle to where they're finished right. They're treated humanely. But one of the really big deals was, what if I could slaughter those animals right on site and not put them on a truck? And that's what we do. And then the other thing is, don't box the beef. Let it hang. At least 6 days, just for the food safety perspective. When we started boxing beef, that's when we had the jack-in-the-box problem, remember? But we never acknowledged that the reason we've got a problem with E. coli in these hamburgers is because IBP in their box isn't hanging the cattle. And if you hang them 6 to 7 days, that wipes out the bad bacteria. We never had this problem when I was working in that meat market in high school in 1968 or 9 in that time frame. And so let's hang those cattle. And if we can cut them direct to retail, after 2 to 3 weeks, that's as good as you can get. You can't get it better than that. And what excites me about the Tenet thing is now if we can bring in the genome solution of tenderness and add it to what I just said, I think you've got something that's spectacular, and I think it really moves the beef industry in the right direction. So,
Thank you, Mike. About my bedtime, are you guys winding down yet?
I got more questions, but.
Keep them coming.
No, do you have a grass finishing feedlot type direction? I mean, if that's your next step, we've got the numbers and the producers here. Do you have a grass-based feeder to team up with yet?
Yeah, so we do that now, and we use a lot of irrigated pivots. Everybody that was around years ago when we tried to put the deal together with Cactus and Tyson, obviously that didn't work out. We still do the same thing. Right now, we do a lot of it in Nebraska, South Dakota, and Montana, and they do that for us now in programs. And so really, once we work through all of our testing in our internal panels, at that point, that's when we would turn over the procurement to them and direct them to procure Tenet cattle to finish in those systems.
Next step is finding the retailers.
So the next step, so what we're doing now, as I mentioned, we're testing a bunch of animals that just to come in to see what percentage of Tenet exists in our current supply. And we're going to identify those animals, and we're going to do internal panels with the salespeople. The plan is from there, based on what we think we know about the supply availability, would be to get with one particular retailer, and I'm not going to name any names, but one particular retailer and launch it with them. So we'd have our finisher, again, it would be regional, it'd be one particular retailer, and that's how it would get started. Because the other component of all of this is that we've got to figure out what the point of differentiation is in the value. We think we know what it is, but ultimately the true value is what the consumer is going to pay for, and is the demand going to be there? Will they pay up a little bit for it? I think they will. Will the demand be there? We already see it. We don't have the supply. We've tried to do this before. What's different about now is we've always had the supply. We were trying to create the demand. But right now we've got the demand for the product, and we need to find the supply.
Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but if everybody here advertised a little bit and created an opportunity for somebody to try the beef or to get it on a regular basis, aren't we creating that demand and starting that? I mean, it's a small footprint, but that's a start.
Yeah.
So we've got these outlets of classifieds for people. If they call me at Pharo Cattle Company and say, hey, where can I get some of this? And I can point them in a direction, we're starting to move somewhere.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's why I had put on here, I mean, initially, before we thought there would be any demand or that we would get, I don't want to call it a major packer, but a major branded program on board, I always thought that the growth strategy was going to be exactly what you're talking about, and that is just working with smaller direct-to-consumer producers, and it was going to be a grassroots deal that was going to get the word out. I didn't think the majors would ever jump on it or anything like that. I always thought it would be the small direct-to-consumer producers that would get the word out.
So I might be hearing this wrong, but what I'm hearing is, I have this beef, what do I do with it? Well, put it out there. Knock on doors, get it on our classifieds, let us work together, and we can build this together.
Yeah, we put that out there with the producers that have called. We've said, look, we want to launch some strategic marketing campaigns with you to help you move your product, because we get the calls and there's the demand there. If we can point them in that direction, great. I mean, Kit marketed bundles to a group of ranchers. We've all got our freezers full with beef. Maybe it's just curiosity, but that's not the ideal group to market product to. And he was able to do it and move all of his product very quickly. If you can do that quickly with a group of ranchers, I think you can do it at the consumer level even quicker and more effectively. But it's still so new. I mean, I want to reiterate that as well. I mean, this is something that we just started 3 months ago. And we've already done a number of cuttings, and we've had great feedback, and there's demand there. But it will absolutely take some time to build brand awareness and create value for it. But that's the goal, that's the plan. We're going to keep swinging at it.
All right, I appreciate you coming tonight. Give me a hand.